Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Hello to the listeners of Bird Podcast. We have a very interesting episode today about 007 or James Bond. Is there a link between birds and James Bond? Well, our guest today, author and American birder Jim Wright, says there is. In fact, the title of his latest book says it all. It's called The Real James Bond, a true story of identity theft, avian intrigue, and Ian Fleming. The introduction says, long before Ian Lancaster Fleming became a best-selling author, a single-minded Philadelphia ornithologist named James Bond wrote a book called Birds of the West Indies, based on repeated expeditions to the Bahamas and the Caribbean from 1927 to 1935. But beyond this book, Jim, our author, is an avid birder, nature photographer, and a blogger. He writes the Birdwatcher column for USA Today, a newspaper based in New Jersey, where he is also the deputy marsh warden and the official counter of the local Hawkwatch. Welcome, Jim Wright, to the Bird Podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So since this is a podcast for birders as well as James Bond fans, I'm going to alternate questions about your birding expertise and your book, if that's okay.
Great.
Okay. So who was the real James Bond, Jim?
So the real James Bond was an ornithologist, explorer, and author, born in 1900 and died in 1989. So he lived most of the 20th century. And he was born very wealthy, kind of lost his inheritance, and went to the West Indies single-handedly, basically, and did research down there documenting all the bird species. And in 1936, he published Birds of the West Indies, which became the definitive guide for several decades and remained in print for, until the 2000, so 7 decades it was in print. It was the go-to guide.
That's more than most authors can say about for 7 decades, a long time, yeah. And in your introductory section, you talk about specific birds that the real James Bond loved, like the bee hummingbird, of course, and a few others.
Yeah, some of these birds are just, you sort of know them now because of the bee hummingbird, the world's smallest bird. And I did see it in person when I went to Cuba, and it's really, you can't believe it's a bird. But the red-billed streamer-tail of Jamaica is the national bird of Jamaica. Bond helped popularize that, as did Ian Fleming. And I think the one quest that Bond failed at was he never saw an ivory-billed woodpecker in Cuba, although he tried. And he was, we'll talk about it later, but he was quite a conservationist as well.
Okay. Is the ivory-billed woodpecker extant or extinct now?
I think it's been extinct for quite a while. I know there's some controversy about it, and Cuba, maybe there's a couple down there, but I tend to doubt it. And Bond never saw one, and he spent a lot of time down there. So I tend to think it's extinct.
Your book has some lovely images. So right after this question, maybe you would like to show us some, but I wanted to ask you about the real James Bond meeting Ian Fleming. So maybe that's a segue to us looking at some of your slides.
That'd be great. I think that's a very good segue. So I will share my screen here, and we'll give it a shot. Just have to hit a couple buttons.
There you go.
So that's the cover of the book, and I love the cover. It's they call it the Birdman, and that is a Cuban green woodpecker on the head. Mm-hmm. And the artist got it off a postage stamp, and it just worked out great, I think. So this is the real James Bond around 1950, and he got married a couple of years later when he was in his 50s. His wife always insisted that he was as handsome as Sean Connery of the 007 fame. And this, of course, is The Birds of the West Indies by James Bond. Every time I look at the cover, I see new things. And one thing that really struck me, that bird is a Cuban toady. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, there's an illustration with a hole in it, and that is the bird's nest hole. And you don't see many field guides that have that kind of detail in them. But I just love the book, and so did Ian Fleming. And he was, after World War II, he would spend his winters in Jamaica. And the bird book he used to identify the birds down there was Birds of the West Indies. And in 1952, he was getting married, getting nervous, and decided he would write a spy thriller. He needed a name for his secret agent. Looked down at the book, saw James Bond, and said, "Hey, that's a perfect name." So he basically just took the name, never told James Bond he had done this, yes. And it was about a decade before James Bond fever hit America, and Bond, the real Bond, realized that he'd had his identity stolen. So Mary Bond would start getting late night phone calls after the 007 craze began to hit. And breathless females would go, "Hello, could I speak to James, please?" And Mary Bond says, "What?" She would hang up. She didn't know what was going on until a friend read an interview with Ian Fleming where Fleming admitted that he had stolen the name. So Mary Bond gets Fleming's address, writes to him and says, "Hey, you stole my husband's name." And Fleming replies to Mrs. James Bond and says, "Yes, you caught me red-handed. You know, I apologize. And if you ever want to name a horrible bird after me, that's fine. And if you're ever in Jamaica, please stop by and see me." Not realizing that Mary Bond would take him up on his word. So one day in 1964, James Bond and Ian Fleming meet. Bond shows up unannounced at Goldeneye, where Fleming wrote all the 007 books, and introduced himself. And Fleming said, "You're not here to sue me, are you?" And Bond says, "No, I don't even read your books. My wife does, but I really am not a big fan at all." And Fleming said, "Well, I can't blame you at all, and come on in." And so they're walking in the backyard, and Fleming says, "Hey, could you identify those birds there?" And Bond says, "Oh yeah, they're cave swallows. You can tell by the, you know, the wings, the wing bars or whatever." And yeah. I think that was Fleming testing Bond to see if he actually was an ornithologist, and Bond certainly rose to the occasion. So at the end of the day, they got along really well. Once Fleming realized he wasn't going to get sued, and when Bond was leaving, Fleming took out his latest book called "You Only Live Twice" and signed it to the real James Bond from the thief of his identity. Ian Fleming, February 5th, 1964, a great day. And so just as Ian Fleming stole James Bond's name for his secret agent, I took the real James Bond from that inscription and used it for the title of my book, sort of a turnabout is fair play. So that's for the next thing we're going to talk about, I think. But that's
okay.
A ball.
So so then maybe we stop screen sharing for that bit.
Great.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So you've written about America's most iconic bird, the bald eagle. Tell us about the spectacular raptor.
Well,
and actually, I don't know if we need the photograph because Indians, everybody is familiar with this bird because of.
Yes, it is a spectacular bird. It's a symbol of the United States. I used to lead a lot of bird walks in the Meadowlands outside of New York City, and you can see a lot of really amazing birds. But when a bald eagle flew over, people, they dropped everything, their jaws dropped. They said, "This is an incredible bird." And the amazing story about this, I did a lot of research, and it turned out in the state of New Jersey, 40 years ago, there was only one bald eagle nest. And that was because of DDT. The eagles were pretty much wiped out. And the eagle nest had eggs in it, but the eggs would never hatch because the DDT made the eggshells too thin for them to be incubated. So the state Department of Environmental Protection moved in and saw the problem, and they had someone climb the tree with plaster of Paris bald eagle eggs, took the real bald eagle eggs out of the nest, put in the plaster of Paris ones, put the eagle eggs on a hot water bottle and drove them to the next state over where they were incubated in a regular incubation chamber. Then once they were hatched and healthy, they brought them back to the nest and put them in the nest, and the parents accepted them immediately and raised them. So the first bald eagles that made a comeback in New Jersey were actually hatched in a neighboring state. Later on, they realized it's an amazing story, but it gets better. The ornithologists realized the best way to incubate the eggs was not through an artificial heat of an incubator, but they discovered that certain chickens love to sit on eggs, and they brought the eagle eggs to the state of Maryland, where these brood hens would sit on the eagle eggs and hatch the eggs, and they'd raise the eaglets, put them back in the nest, and they would go along having a healthy life. So it turns out that many of the first bald eagles in New Jersey were hatched in Maryland by chickens. And so we're down to one eagle nest in 1980. And I haven't looked at the recent figures, but I think it's something like in New Jersey over 200, thriving eagle nests. So from one eagle nest 40 years ago, we now have over 200, 300 baby eagles hatched this year. It's an amazing success story. And so I wrote this book about the eagles' comeback and how they do so well. There's a place in New Jersey that has a live eagle cam. And if you start watching from January on, you can see the eggs being laid, incubating, hatched. It's really an amazing thing. And I wrote this ebook for that group.
So what would our listeners search on? So would it be Duke Farms Eagle Cam or?
Yes, Duke Farms Eagle Cam. I'm not sure it's operating right now because they have it down for off-season maintenance. But when it's up, it is, people around the world go watch it. It's spectacular.
It's really interesting because one of our guests is Cy Montgomery. She's also an author, and she talks about the amazing comeback of the American Condor, which was right on the other side of the coast.
Yeah, I was going to say the other side of the nation.
Yeah.
That's a great story as well.
I read your blog, and for those who haven't, you should look it up. It's called Celery Farm and Beyond. And in it, Jim describes the raptor counts that he has done at a place called Stateline Hawkwatch. So can you talk a little bit about the raptors that you see in your neck of the woods, including one that you call the Beast?
Yes. So Stateline Lookout is this wonderful hawkwatch overlooking the Hudson River just north of New York City. And on a right day, we'll get hundreds of migrating hawks. And right now it's broadwing time, and that's a small buteo, and they go flying over, and you do your best to count them. And on slow days, there is a local bird they call the Beast, and it is a peregrine falcon who kind of just runs the show. She flies around. If there's a peregrine falcon out from outside the territory, she will attack it. I just saw a picture yesterday of the Beast flying back to her perch with a gull she had killed mid-air. The gull was bigger than she was. She
oh
still
my word.
was carrying it. So the Stateline Hawkwatch is probably the best place on the East Coast to photograph peregrine falcons because they are there all the time. They're used to people. They perch on a branch 6 feet away from you. I think there's a picture of it somewhere if I share a screen. And the other great place and the historic place, I wrote a book about that as well, is Hawk Mountain. And that is in Pennsylvania. And that is the granddaddy of hawkwatches in the United States and perhaps the world. And it's an amazing inspirational story. Back in the 1930s, these birds would migrate past Stateline Hawkwatch and then all the way down to the Blue Mountains of Pennsylvania. And the coal miners on weekends for sport used to take shotguns and shoot the birds as they migrated through. And there would be fields filled with dead raptors. And when a conservationist in New York City named Rosalie Edge heard about this, she was outraged. And she had enough money, she actually leased the side of that mountain during hawk migration and banned hunting. And
she leased the mountain. She just leased the entire
mountainside. And they had a guy named Maurice Baroon who went there, and he was the sort of the warden and prevented hunters from going there. It was a huge mess. I can show you some pictures if you like.
Sure.
Does that work?
Yeah.
And so that's the bald eagle. And this is Hawk Mountain. And this is where the gunners would sit. And now we have guys with spotting scopes and binoculars. The birds would fly down the ridge, and the guys with shotguns in the 1930s would shoot them out of the air. The fields were littered with these dead migrating hawks. And Rosalie Edge came in, bought the mountainside. And one of her advisors, I learned recently, scientific advisors, was James Bond, who worked in Philadelphia about 80 miles away. This is a picture of all the hawks, and this is horrible to see, but this is the carnage at Hawk Mountain. These hawks are gunned down by the thousands.
We have photos like that of the Maharajas killing birds in Bharatpur.
Yes, so it's disturbing to see. I'm glad the pictures are very old. But yeah. So they set up the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary and about that as well. You know, he was doing some terrible things to birds, but sometimes some people stand up and try to right that situation. And now it's totally illegal. You can't, people try it, but you should not be hunting hawks. And you can be prosecuted for it and go to jail. So it's pretty inspirational. Now this is the beast's, I think that's the beast's son. He's smaller, but I found this picture and I just photographed it last week. And this bird was, 8 feet from me tops right at the Hawkwatch. And if you're a photographer, these guys fly by and you get these pictures of peregrine falcons better than this routinely. And I hope to write a birding column in a few weeks about the beast and how amazing she is. So I'll stop sharing the screen now. That is a Bahama nuthatch, and I can talk about that later.
Okay, yeah. What attracts you to raptors? What attracts you to raptors, Jim? And
they are just, well, raptors, as you go, are dynamic birds, and they are the top of the food chain. And like the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon, they almost went extinct because of DDT. And so I'm really attracted to these large birds that made this incredible comeback. I should mention, I don't know if you have this problem in India, but in the United States, we have this terrible rat poison. It's called second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. And in America, all kinds of businesses put these rat poison bait stations outside restaurants and businesses. The rats go in, eat the poison, then go off to die, and the raptors will eat the rat and then die from the poison as well. So I've begun a campaign in New Jersey, starting with my own hometown, to discourage businesses from using these and town governments from ever using this kind of bait station. So it's a long way to go, but the local raptor that I love most of all is called a red-shouldered hawk. And we found one of those poisoned by this rat poison. The red-shouldered hawk, which is a small buteo, had eaten the rat poison and then died. And same thing with great horned owls and other hawks. So it's really sad to say. Rats are a huge problem, I realize, but there are other ways than using this really horrible method that will kill wildlife, pets, and other birds.
I didn't know that,
So
because here in India, I didn't know that about that rats would, I didn't see the food chain. Here in India, we have diclofenac, which is a drug given to cattle that are in pain. And then after the cattle die, the vultures eat them, and the same thing happens. The vultures get poisoned. Yes. And
that's right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I had a friend, an ornithologist at Hawk Mountain, who was a specialist in vultures, and he would write about that huge problem in India. So we're aware of that over here as well, but very similar situation.
Yeah. And Sai, again, who keeps coming back to my mind because of what you're saying, she said that the American condor was killed by the lead bullets because of the spray that was left behind. So now California has banned that and made copper, I think it is.
That's amazing. They do autopsies, or called necropsies, on bald eagles and other raptors. And even if they haven't died from secondary rat poison, they'll find that in their system. And they will also find lead in their system from birdshot and things that are gotten into the environment.
Yeah.
Like DDT got into the water supply and into the rivers. And every time a bald eagle ate a fish, it was like by rat poison.
So back to Bond. In 1936, he wrote Birds of the West Indies. And tell us about the Birds of the West Indies.
I really admired Bond. I started out writing a news column, a birding column about James Bond. And the more I learned about him, the more amazed I was. And a lot of these expeditions to faraway places were like the Vanderbilt expedition. A lot of wealthy guys with servants, and they would go there and, sort of live high on the hog. They lived in tents and had their food brought to them, cooked. Bond went to the West Indies on his own. He worked without a salary, and he didn't have that much money, so he would travel by mail ship. And although he got seasick when he traveled, he sailed to the West Indies for several months at a time. When he got to the West Indies by himself, he traveled by banana boat, sloop, rum runner, any means he could go from island to island. He would travel on foot or on horseback, carrying shotgun, arsenic, and a pocket knife, basically a scalpel, and he would shoot the birds and collect them and then bring them back to the United States. And a lot of these birds now that he collected in the 1920s and 1930s are time capsules. And scientists can go and look at their DNA and find out what the environment was like those days, how many of that species were around in those days. And one of the birds he discovered was called the Bahama nuthatch. And Bond was traveling to a remote in the Bahamas, a remote part of the Grand Bahama Island, and he bummed a ride with a rum runner, and the guy dropped him off. Bond spent the night. He was on deck with 5-gallon cans of rum they were smuggling into the United States. He dropped them off at this island. He got there and spent several days collecting, and amongst the birds he found was a nuthatch he didn't really recognize. And it became known as the Bahama nuthatch, and it was considered a subspecies of the nuthatch in the United States until very recently. And at the same time, it was considered a distinct species. It was also considered a distinct species because of all those hurricanes that have been hitting the West Indies and the Bahamas. think the highest level above sea level is about 10 feet. So when the hurricanes hit these islands, the birds really take a hit. And the Bahama nuthatch probably went extinct after that. Bond also did the bee hummingbird, the world's smallest bird. He did the red-billed streamer-tail, which Ian Fleming wrote about in For Your Eyes Only. And you think of, James Bond, the secret agent, and Ian Fleming writing about, booze and broads and, guns and all that crazy stuff. Ian Fleming in For Your Eyes Only, the first 300 words, he writes about the red-billed streamer-tail and says, "This is the most beautiful bird in Jamaica, and some would say the world." And he goes, it's just wonderfully written. It was almost written by, you can see he loves birds. It was written so beautifully. I would recommend people read For Your Eyes Only. It's an amazing story. One thing I learned, and this is kind of a spoiler alert, but bad guys in 007 novels often shoot birds as a way of showing how evil they are.
I want to bring up an article by Michael Lewis called Scientists or Spies. And I know you've seen it, but for those who are interested, it talks about ecologists in a climate of Cold War suspicion, which was when the real James Bond was operating as well. And the India connection has to do with our legendary Salim Ali and his collaborator, Dylan Ripley, who is an American from Yale University, from your neck of the woods. So I'll just say a little bit about it before asking my next question, if I may. There's an interesting section in the article, which is available online. It begins with a New Yorker profile of Ripley in 1950, which basically outs Ripley as a spy. And Ripley was in India in the Northeast, sort of lurking around the borderlands when the piece was published. And presumably then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru read it. So Ripley goes and he finds forest after forest, which is close to him. So it seems like in one fell swoop, he had alienated the Prime Minister of India and his old friend Salim Ali. And 7 years later, Salim Ali goes down the path that would end up with his own troubles with the government of India. I mean, he was accused as being a contributor, being participant to a US biological warfare program. And the reason for that was this now controversial Bharatpur bird banding project that Salim Ali undertook with money from the US Army. All of which is a long-winded segue to asking my next question. You've said in your book, bird watching is old, bird watcher is old intelligence slang for spy. Now, do ornithologists really make spies? Do they make good spies? And if so, why?
So one of the things that was a nice surprise researching my book, I discovered that at least 6 of Bond's colleagues during World War II, ornithologists, were spies for the United States, the OSS, including Dylan Ripley. And Dylan Ripley and James Bond knew each other in the 1930s and were friends into the 1960s. So the Bond-Dylan Ripley connection is very strong. And there are other amazing people who worked with James Bond at the Academy of Natural Sciences. There's a guy named Brooke Dolan, who during World War II undertook a secret mission to go to Tibet and meet the Dalai Lama when the Dalai Lama was age 7 or 8, and give him secret papers from Franklin Delano Roosevelt and a very expensive pocket watch. And so these guys, Leo Tolstoy's grandson and Brooke Dolan, by horseback went over the mountains to Tibet and into China. And they were looking for an overland trade route to get goods to China to fight the Japanese. So these guys are real spies, and it was pretty heavy duty. I have a list of armaments they brought with them, and pretty astounding stuff. I have one bizarre story. In researching the book, I heard that the Dalai Lama still loves the pocket watch that Brooke Dolan and Tolstoy gave him, and that he still carries it with him.
Huh.
So I decided I would get in touch with the Dalai Lama, and it turns out you can only get in touch with him by fax.
Huh.
And so I had the fax address was in India, and I pulled out my old fax machine. I wrote the Dalai Lama a letter. I sent the fax, and the thing is going, click, 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 but it's not going through. And I realized how expensive it must be to send a fax to India. So I quickly hung up the phone before I racked up all these expensive charges. And 1 minute later, my phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's the local police department. And I said, "Hi, what's up?" Said, "Did you just dial 911, the emergency phone number?" And I said, "Oh my goodness.
India's country code is 91.
Yeah, so I was going to say, well, I was faxing the Dalai Lama and I forgot to put the area code in, but I realized that would sound like a crazy person. So I said I was trying to fax India. My wife is fine. This is not a domestic violence situation. I'll put her on the phone and everything will be okay. And my wife is there and she's laughing at the whole thing. So I don't send faxes to India anymore.
So I have 3 last questions, Jim. Have you been to the West Indies, and what are some, first of all, have you been? And if so,
yes. So one of the great things I enjoyed most about the book was going to Cuba. So I have a picture behind me here of the Bay of Pigs, where James Bond actually went there. He went to the Zapata Swamp, as did I. I've also been to the Bahamas. I went to, I went to Jamaica a couple of times, and went to Golden Eye, and saw the birds of the Blue Mountains. Just wonderful memories and great places to go birding. They have so many endemic species down there. It's spectacular. And
the second to last question is, what is the real James Bond's legacy? You mentioned a couple of things in your book, including
all the birds. He collected all kinds of birds. He collected eggs, frogs, and they're now in museums, and they're not just stuffed birds. They are full of information that scientists use to this day. Bond also came up with the theory that the birds from the West Indies are from North America originally, not South America, as was previously thought. And that's called Bond's line, or the Bond line. And also, even in his first Birds of the West Indies, his introduction, he talked about the dangers of clear-cutting rainforests for plantation. He thought that they should establish bird sanctuaries where no hunting was allowed. He wrote about the illegal parrot trade and how terrible it is. And all these problems still are with us today. So he was, 80 years ahead of his time writing about these things. And the more I learn about him, the more I appreciate him and what he contributed.
So I always end with a question that I ask all my guests. What are your favorite bird species and why?
Good question. I love the pileated woodpecker. That is a giant woodpecker in my neck of the woods, and it is the closest I will ever come to an ivory-billed woodpecker, I believe. But these are huge, dynamic birds. There's a cartoon character called Woody Woodpecker, and he's kind of based on the pileated, crazy laugh that he has. So I love those guys, and I love the red-shouldered hawks because they nest near me, and I kind of watch over them and try to protect them. So, and they're just beautiful birds for birds' sake.
So Jim Wright, I hope that when any of our listeners or viewers watch a 007 film, they actually doff a hat to the real James Bond, thanks to you. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you. Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for listening.